back in 1973 when we were in Paris, I don't know exactly what the occasion was, but I began to show my poems in progress to Carol and ask her for her opinions about this and that. And so she got very involved in response, and I realized that while she's not a poet and has never written poetry, she's very bright and has done a lot of reading and has a kind of a literary sensibility. And so I started showing her first and second drafts of poems, and she would go over them and make comments on them, and then we would talk about them, and she would ask me questions about this and that. And I write in a way that tries to remain open to sort of kind of shots from the subconscious. In other words, I try not to be simply a conscious writer. I try to make use of a kind of a dream mind at the same time that I'm consciously proposing generally a particular direction or a field to work. And so there's a lot of stuff that comes up in first, or used to, not so much anymore, in first and second drafts that was not pertinent. And she was very good at catching cliches and dead ends and things like that. And then I would go back and do more work on the poem, and sometimes I would show it to her 2 or 3 times, and each time why we would talk about it. And while she didn't do any of the actual writing that ended up in the final draft, so it was not like a team effort, her presence as a person to talk to and to probe me in terms of what I was doing was very useful, very useful. Most of my views of the translation of poetry came from my contact with the man that I mentioned earlier, who had been extremely critical of my first efforts at poetry, Sid Corman, when we were both in Kyoto in 1962, 63, and 64. Corman used to go to, he lived in a room, so you couldn't visit him in his room. But every evening, or about 6 evenings a week, he would go to a coffee shop called the Muse in downtown Kyoto, and he would sit at a table and he would read and write, and if you wanted to see Sid, that's where you went. And so I would go in once a week. I would walk from where I lived, took about a half an hour to get down to the Muse. I would walk in and I'd sit with Sid and just go with whatever happened. And I was starting to work on Vallejo at this point. So I would take my Vallejo translations in, and Sid would look at them and he'd make comments on them. And he would quiz me. Well, why did you do this? Why did you do that? How did you choose this word? And I began to realize that translation was not only a form of a creative activity, but it was also scholarly. It meant that I really realized that I had to constantly check words. And what I was really up against was getting an accurate version of Vallejo into English, not sort of turning Vallejo into a kind of pseudo-Eshelman poem, which many translations of poetry are. They're neither here nor there. They don't belong to the poet any longer, and they really don't belong to the translator. But so the thing that I learned from Sid was to become an accurate translator that respected the original and tried to bring as much of the original into the second language and protect the sort of the psyche and the nature of the original poem. And so I still believe that today. I think that the majority of people that I know of who are writing poetry in America today are students or were students that have degrees in creative writing. And this is starting to become the image of American poetry. And I think that will have a very negative effect on American poetry. To put it in a kind of a simple English image, a young poet would be much better with a knapsack full of books, squatting at the edge of the Congo and reading books and looking at the river for 2 years than he would be in Iowa getting an MFA in poetry. He would learn things about himself by looking at the river and batting flies, as it were, and staying down there and doing it and reading it and eating there, etc., that he won't in creative writing seminars.